Good morning. It's weird saying good morning from up here. Not a morning person, so we'll see how this goes. I want to remind everybody about our gospel meeting next week. Looking forward to that. And even more than the gospel meeting, looking forward to what happens Sunday afternoon next week. That potluck. That's the number one most important thing that's going on next week. Really looking forward to that. I want to start this morning by talking about this movie. Might work. Maybe not. You might have to click, Ken. The Power of the Dog is the movie. We're going to figure this thing out eventually. Yeah, there it is. All right, it works. There we go. So The Power of the Dog. It's one of the most talked about films from this past year. The Oscar award-winning film. The film is set in Montana in the 1920s, and it focuses on these two brothers, Phil and George Burbank. They're wealthy ranchers who live in Montana. And as the movie begins, they're on a cattle drive, and they meet this woman named Rose who runs a boarding house. Now, Rose is not married at this point, but she has a son named Peter from a previous marriage. And Peter is this exaggeratedly effeminate young man. And the first time that Phil, and that's the brother who's in the middle of this picture, first time that he meets Rose and Peter, he essentially bullies them. He treats them so harshly that he drives them both to tears. And all the while, he's reveling in their pain, enjoying the laughter of his cowhands. But George Burbank, his brother, goes back to meet Rose and to comfort her. And he ends up becoming smitten by her, and they get married. And he brings her and Peter back to the brothers' big old rambling ranch house to live. And it's at this point that Phil, that other brother, his persecution of Rose really begins. Now, if you're planning on watching this movie, you might want to not pay attention for the next 20 seconds. But one of the big surprises that's revealed during the course of the film is that Phil is actually a highly educated, a classically trained figure. He went to an Ivy League school. He's brilliant. He's cultivated. But in the film, he's this dirty, like physically, literally dirty. He's a rancher. He's a man of few words. He's difficult to get along with. It's hard to believe that he is this intelligent, wise figure. But you can actually see it in how he deals with people. Because he's someone who knows how to find someone's point of psychological weakness, their insecurities. He finds it, and then if he doesn't like you, he hits on it over and over and over again. And that's what he does to Rose, to this new lady who's come into his life, his sister-in-law. He finds her point of weakness, and he hits on it over and over and over again until eventually she's driven to alcoholism and basically to where she can't function at all. But his real ire, even more than on Rose, is on Peter, on this effeminate young man that is Rose's daughter, or Rose's son, not daughter. He is effeminate, but not that effeminate. But, his treatment of Peter makes his treatment of Rose look weak. Because he takes Peter in. Halfway through the film, he's been treating Peter awfully this whole time. And all the cowhands also are piling on. They're making this boy's life absolutely miserable. All these adults in his life are just incessantly bullying him, needling him, verbally abusing him. But halfway through the film, Phil, the one who's on the end here, the brother, he takes Peter under his wing. And it's really strange because up to this point, he's been bullying him without any mercy whatsoever. But he takes him under his wing, and we're left to wonder why. It seems like it's just the latest effort to hurt him even more, right? Bring him in, get him to trust you, and then hurt him even more deeply. And at this point in the film, we're probably feeling sorry for Peter. Because you can probably imagine how well he fits in as this young man who's not into the things that everybody else around him are into in this ranch environment. He's not fitting in very well. He's bullied. We're feeling sorry for him. But it's at this point that we find out that he's no helpless baby. In fact, Peter is a very canny figure who, even more than Phil, knows how to find someone's psychological weaknesses and take advantage of it. So Peter discovers that Phil has some deeply repressed sexual desires. And this young man begins to play upon them, to manipulate Phil, to seduce him, to exploit him. And by the time we get to the end of the movie, Phil is effectively destroyed by Peter, by this weak and bullied young man. And as the movie comes to a close, we see Peter, this young man who's won the day, we see him reading from the Scriptures, from the Bible. And as the camera pans over, we find he's reading from Psalm 22. And this is where the mysterious title of the film and of this sermon comes from, The Power of the Dog. The Power of the Dog. In the movie, Peter is reading from the King James Version, Psalm 22 and verse 20. So we'll read it from that as well. It's up on the screen. From the King James Version, deliver my soul from the sword, my darling from the power of the dog. Now the point is that this power exchange, this power dynamic, where powerful people are interacting, is really the underlying morality and interest of this movie. Because throughout the movie, Phil, this powerful person, has been persecuting Peter's mother, his darling. And he's been persecuting Peter. But in the end, Peter's found a way to be delivered from the power of the dog. And those power dynamics, powerful people interacting with one another, is really what make this movie. Because there's something deep down inside of us that appeals to. We're drawn to power. We want power. We want the ability to change things. That's true individually, but it's also true culturally. Our culture is obsessed with power. It wants to know who's in power, who's not in power, and how are those who are in power treating those who are not in power. And this sermon is not political commentary. It's not focused on our culture at large. Instead, we're going to focus on our own lives and on the Christian story as a whole. What are the power dynamics of the gospel? What are the power dynamics of the gospel? And what does that have to do with our lives? To do that, we're going to go to 1 Corinthians chapter 1. If you're not already there, turn there with me. 1 Corinthians chapter 1. Because in this text, Paul turns everything about power upside down. And to do that, he takes us to what seems to be an odd place. He takes us to the cross. Now, even if this is your first time in a church service, you probably have heard about the cross, right? You've seen the cross. You may have heard of Jesus crying out on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, right? You've probably heard that phrase. But what you may not know is that phrase is actually a quotation of the Old Testament. It's a quotation from Psalm 22, that same psalm. It's actually the opening line of that psalm. And what Jesus is doing here seems to be common in the ancient world. He's quoting the first line of a psalm as a way to refer to the entirety of the psalm. So when he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? It seems that he's using that as kind of a shorthand way to refer to the entirety of Psalm 22. Now, Psalm 22 is a psalm that starts in a very dark place because the psalmist is surrounded by this dog that's really making his life absolutely miserable. That's why he cries out, my God, why are you so far from helping me? Why aren't you with me? Why aren't you saving me? That's why he cries out, because he's surrounded by this dog and his power. But he cries out to God for help, and by the time we reach the end of the psalm, he arises victorious. So it turns out that even though God didn't seem like he was going to help him, even though he seemed weak, he didn't seem powerful enough, in the end, he wins. And that's really a microcosm of the entire story of the cross. And that's the message that Paul, even though he doesn't cite Psalm 22, it's the same message that he gets across to us here in 1 Corinthians chapter 1. Begin reading with me in verse 18. We won't read the whole thing. We'll start with just this one verse. For the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. Don't miss how ridiculously preposterous this is. We've used the cross for almost 2,000 years as a positive religious symbol, as decoration, as jewelry. And that has served to dull the impact of the word cross. But the Romans used crucifixion to teach a lesson, to make an example out of somebody. You had to mess up really, really bad to be crucified. It was saved for only the worst of the worst. Only the revolutionaries and the terrorists and the slaves, they were the ones who were crucified. So the word cross had connotations of contempt and weakness and a loser and a criminal and a slave and an unpatriotic lowlife. It stood for pretty much everything bad in their society. To anyone who's thinking, this word of the cross that Paul mentions here is the complete opposite of a powerful message. Because if we're looking at this from the world's point of view, our leader, our Savior, our God, not only did he lose to the Jews, not only did he lose to the Romans, not only did he go back to where he apparently came from, he died on a cross of all places. And that's your Savior? That's your King? That's your God? That's foolish. It makes absolutely no sense. But to us, Paul says, it's the power of God. Now, how in the world is that possible? Well, look at verse 19. Here he quotes from Isaiah 29 and verse 14. He says, it's written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart. Where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? We believe that that cross and what happened on it is powerful because God said that this is what he was going to do. Way back in Isaiah, 700 years before it happened. He said, look, I'm going to take that wisdom, I'm going to flip it on its own head. So in the cross, he takes everything that makes sense from our point of view, and he flips it. It makes no sense that that moment would be the pinnacle of the entirety of human history. But here we are. It is the power of God. He has made all of the wisdom of the world look foolish by this one simple, shameful act of dying on the cross. He took all of that wisdom and he turned it into its exact opposite, foolishness. How did he do that? Well, look at verse 21. For since in the wisdom of God, the world did not know God through wisdom, it pleased God through the folly of what we preach to save those who believe. There's no getting around this fact. And this is what turns that wisdom on its head, turns it into foolishness. That no matter how foolish it seems, in that cross, God saves us. That's what turns this whole thing on its head. Now, don't get Paul wrong. This is folly, right? The folly of what we preach. This is foolishness. This is the word from which we get our word, moron. This message was moronic. A crucified Savior? That's an oxymoron. It's a contradiction of terms. That's like saying fried ice. You can't have both of them together. It's folly, Paul says. So our faith is not the confirmation of our best efforts, our best insights. It's actually the replacement of them. The gospel doesn't just take our best expectations and flip them on their head. And it doesn't just take our worst expectations and flip them on their head. It takes all of them. It takes our best and our worst and revolutionizes it to where it doesn't make sense to us. But it's actually the wisdom of God. The God revealed in the cross of Jesus does not and cannot fit into our expectations of how the world works. And you see this in verse 22. Paul mentions two classes of people that reflect our natural expectations. He says that the Jews demand signs. It's reasonable. The Greeks seek wisdom. That's reasonable. They expect God to make sense to them. If God exists, of course he's going to act powerfully. Of course he's going to act rationally, or he's not God. And of course, we would say that God is all-powerful and all-reasonable, all-wise, all-knowing. But the kicker in all of this is that the turning point of all of human history, the point at which everything revolves, is the point where our God, in human flesh, is made to look all weak and all foolish, dying on a cross. In that moment, he turned all of those expectations on their heads. We don't claim to believe the Christian message because it's everything we would have expected. Nobody would have expected this. But in that event, in that unpredictable, incalculable event of the cross, God changed everything. Look at verse 23. In contrast to their expectations, in contrast to the Jews and the Greeks, we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and folly to Gentiles. Instead of giving them the signs and the wisdom that they demand, and God has plenty of both, right? He could have given it to them. He could have given them those signs and that wisdom. But instead, they get weakness and foolishness. Now, that's why the Greeks thought that the Christian message was laughable. This wasn't some trendy new philosophy. It wasn't something that made sense. This was a joke. It was news about an executed criminal from a despised race, from the Jews of all people, who died. But now, he demands that everyone on earth obey him, or else they'll be lost. That's utter madness. And what made it even worse is that the Jews themselves weren't fans of this Christian message either. Because no Jew at the time was expecting a Messiah who would come along and lose to the Romans, who would get executed by the Romans. The Messiah was supposed to come and throw off the Romans once and for all. That was the whole point of having a Messiah. But then the Christian message comes along and says the exact opposite. No, they weren't having that. In fact, to them, it was scandalous. This word translated stumbling block is the word where we get our word scandal. To them, this Christian message was scandalous. There's something scandalous about our faith. And if we water that scandal down, or if we try to eliminate it, or if we're ashamed of that scandal, we domesticate the gospel itself. There's something offensive about our message. In Galatians chapter 5 and verse 11, Paul says, "But if I, brothers, still preach circumcision, why am I still being persecuted?" He says, if I were preaching what these people want me to be preaching, then why are they messing my life up, right? He's saying, I'm staying true to the truth of the gospel. But what would happen if he didn't? In that case, the offense of the cross has been removed. Our message is an offensive message. Now, that doesn't mean that the way we deliver it should be offensive. It should absolutely not be. And there's so many Christians around the world who have delivered our message in an offensive way, and we should be ashamed of that. We should deliver the truth in love. So not the way that we deliver our message, but the message itself is an offensive one. Now, why is that? Well, partially because of Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 22 and 23, which says that if a man has committed a crime punishable by death, and he's put to death, and you hang him on a tree, he's cursed by God. Now, who do we know who was executed for a quote-unquote crime, and then who died hanging from a tree? Sound familiar, right? Jesus. Well, in Galatians 3, Paul takes this text from Deuteronomy and he applies it to Jesus. He said that he was hanged on that tree and he took the curse of God upon him. Now, that's offensive to a Jew. Your Messiah is cursed by God. He dies on a cursed tree. That's an offensive message. You can have a Messiah or you can have crucifixion, but you can't have both. Because a Messiah means splendor and victory and power. But crucifixion means humiliation and defeat and weakness. Those two things can't coexist. There's simply no way that Christ crucified on a tree could fit into the Jewish understanding either of God or of Scripture. Because it's the ultimate contradiction. A crucified Messiah, my God, hanging from a cursed tree, crying out, my God, why? That's pitiful. That's not my Messiah from the Jewish perspective. There's no getting around this scandal. There's no bending it into a less jagged shape or marketing it in a more pleasing form. If we did that, it would no longer be the gospel. Look at verse 24. To those who are called this scandal, both to Jews and Greeks, Christ is the power of God and the wisdom of God. This is the climax of this whole thing. God didn't give them the signs and the wisdom that they demanded. Instead, he showed them what true power and true wisdom really looks like. This whole nasty business of a crucified Messiah was actually the ultimate expression of Isaiah 55, 8 and 9, where God says that my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. Keep that verse in mind. Let's read verse 25. This is the resolution to this whole argument from Paul. He says, the foolishness of God is wiser than men. His thoughts are higher than ours. And the weakness of God is stronger than men. His ways are higher than ours. Nothing about the gospel message makes sense to our natural human ways of thinking. To us, the strong survive. That's what happens in nature, right? The survival of the fittest. And not only that, but the smart survive. If you can figure out things in life, if you're stuck in the wilderness alone and you know what plants to eat and what plants not to eat, you're probably coming out on top in the end. You're going to be okay. Phil, in that movie, as the strongest and in many ways the smartest, he should have kept his perch on top of that heap. He should have won that. But the Christian message takes all of those expectations and it flips them on their heads, because the Christian story is actually the sacrifice of the smartest and the strongest, the sacrifice of Jesus for the survival of the weakest and the most foolish, us. It flips all of that on its head. That type of sacrifice makes no sense. It's irrational. It's foolish. If God had consulted us for wisdom, we could have come up with a much better plan than that. We could have come up with a workable plan. We could have come up with something that would have attracted both the sign seekers and the lovers of wisdom. And at the same time, it wouldn't have been so foolish, so offensive, so scandalous, so weird. But thanks be to God that we were left out of that consultation. Because only God could have been so wise as to come up with something so foolish. It's God's foolishness. It's the greatest story that's ever been told. And it's our story. The Christian good news is that of a God dying on top of a pile of trash at the wrong end of the empire. It's all about God babbling nonsense in a room full of philosophers. It's all about God confronting the power and the posturing and the prestige of this world and overcoming it in order to establish his own kingdom, a kingdom in which the weak and the foolish find themselves just as welcome as the strong and the wise. In other words, Romans chapter 1 verse 16, Paul says, I am not ashamed of the gospel, even as foolish, as humiliating as it is. I'm not ashamed of it. For it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. When people hear that message, they discover to their astonishment that things change. Lives change. Hearts change. Situations change. New communities come into being, consisting of people who've heard that message and they've bought in. They've fallen in love with the God who they find to be alive in Jesus. And they give Jesus their supreme loyalty. And that's how we overcome the power of the dog. That's how we throw off the shackles of the power dynamics and the knowledge obsession of our age. It's not by outsmarting the dog, like Peter did in the movie, and thereby becoming more powerful than him. No, it's nothing quite as easy and tame as that. Instead, it's about accepting God's invitation to join in his foolish story, to take up our own crosses and lead a life of radical self-sacrifice that shows that God's true power and God's true wisdom run my life. So even when someone hurts me, irrationally, I forgive. And even when nothing makes sense, unreasonably, I hope. And even when those metaphorical dogs are all around me, they're circling me, they're trapping me in, I can't see my next step. In that moment, ultimately, I trust. And that trust, the trust in the power that looks weak, in the wisdom that looks foolish, is what ultimately takes me through this life and saves me from the power of the dog. This morning, if you need to put your faith in Jesus for the first time and be baptized into him, won't you do it as we stand and as we sing?
Have you been to Jesus, the cleansing power?